Hello everyone. Before the story start, tell me where are you watching from and what time is it?
The house had been my grandmother's, then my mother's, then mine by the slow, sad arithmetic of inheritance. I had come to clear it out, to sort through the accumulated sediment of 3 generations, to decide what would be kept and what would be surrendered to the dumpster. It was a Tuesday in October, the kind of gray, indifferent day that makes all labor feel futile. I had been at it for hours, my hands raw from cardboard and dust, my lungs thick with the smell of old paper and older memories. The kitchen was the last room. I had saved it, not deliberately, but because the kitchen had always been the heart of the house, and I was not ready to stop its pulse. The cabinets were full of things I recognized: the blue willow pattern plates, the heavy cast iron skillet, the mismatched mugs that had survived every purge because no one could bear to throw away the one with the chip that matched someone's favorite story. I opened drawers and found utensils I had not seen in decades, their handles worn to the exact shape of hands that were no longer here to hold them. The bottom drawer of the old Hoosier cabinet stuck. It always had. I remembered my grandmother cursing it, my mother developing a precise technique for coaxing it open with a tilt and a tug. I knelt before it, braced my feet against the floor, and pulled. It gave with a sudden, grating surrender. Inside, nestled among yellowed recipe cards and faded kitchen twine, was a single object. A brass handle. Not a drawer pull, but a door handle, the kind you turn to enter a room. It was old, its surface tarnished to a deep, honeyed gold, its curves worn smooth by countless hands. I lifted it out, expecting the cold weight of metal. What I felt was warmth. Not the ambient warmth of the room, which was cool and musty. This was a specific, focused heat, as if the handle had been held in a living hand moments before I touched it. It spread from my palm of my arm, a slow, gentle current that carried with it not a memory, but the sensation of memory itself, the texture of a morning I had never lived. I saw, not with my eyes, but with something deeper, the kitchen as it had been 50 years ago. The same room, but alive. Sunlight streamed through the window, warming the same blue willow plates arranged on the same worn counter. My grandmother stood at the stove, her back to me, her gray hair pinned in its usual loose coil. She was humming, a tune I recognized from childhood but could not name. The kettle on the stove began to whistle, a high, insistent note that cut through the quiet. She reached for the handle on the kettle. Her hand closed around it. And in that moment, the warmth in my palm intensified, a flash of heat that was not painful but absolute, a direct transmission of that instant across the decades. I felt the weight of the kettle, the slight give of the handle, the steam rising to meet her face. I felt her weariness, her satisfaction, her quiet, unremarkable love for this routine, this room, this life. Then it was gone. The kitchen returned to its gray, abandoned present. The handle in my hand was cool again, just an object, just brass. But the warmth lingered in my memory, a ghost of sensation that refused to fade. I held the handle for a long time, kneeling on the floor of that empty kitchen, listening to the silence that was no longer empty. I understood, without knowing how, that this was not a trick of imagination or a surge of grief. This was a property of the handle itself. It had absorbed the warmth of that morning, the specific morning when my grandmother had made tea and hummed that nameless tune, and it had held it, waiting for someone to reach for it at the right moment, in the right state of receptivity. I closed my hand around it again, more gently this time, and waited. The warmth returned, but fainter, more distant. I saw my mother, younger than I had ever known her, standing at the same stove, stirring something in a pot, her face smooth and unlined by the griefs that would later carve their paths. She was laughing at something my father had said, off camera, out of frame. The warmth of that laugh, the heat of the stove, the golden light of a different morning, all of it flowed through the handle and into my palm, a brief, unbearable gift. I released it, gasping. The kitchen was gray again. The silence was absolute. But I was not alone. I was surrounded by the accumulated warmth of all the mornings that had ever happened in this room, stored in the grain of the wood, the patina of the brass, the settled dust of decades. The handle was just the most concentrated vessel, the point where the past had chosen to pool. I did not put it back in the drawer. I carried it with me through the rest of the house, my palm wrapped around its worn curve, feeling the occasional pulse of warmth as I passed through other rooms, other moments. The handle was a key, and the house was a lock, and together they opened onto a dimension I had never known existed, the place where the past continues, not as memory, but as presence, waiting to be touched by the right hand at the right time. I left the house that evening, the handle in my pocket, the gray sky finally releasing a soft, persistent rain. I did not look back. I did not need to. I carried the warmth with me, the accumulated mornings of 3 generations, a heat that no amount of time could cool. I reach for it now, sometimes, in the quiet evenings of my own life. It is always warm. Not with the heat of the moment I am living, but with the heat of moments already past, mornings I will never see but can still feel, transmitted through the patient brass of a handle that has learned to hold the sun. The furniture was different. The walls were different. The light, filtered through curtains I had never seen, fell on surfaces I had never touched. I had expected the assault of memory, the ghosts of old arguments and quiet evenings superimposed on this alien present. What I felt was not memory. It was absence. The house had moved on. It had become someone else's container for someone else's life. I walked through the rooms anyway, a ghost in someone else's machine. The living room, where we had watched the snow fall on the first night we moved in. The kitchen, where she had taught me to make her grandmother's sauce, her hands over mine on the wooden spoon. The bedroom, where we had argued and made up and argued again, the walls absorbing it all with the patient indifference of plaster and paint. The rooms remembered nothing. They were just rooms. I found myself in the upstairs hallway, facing a door I had opened and closed 10,000 times. Our bedroom. The door was closed now, a smooth, painted surface that gave no hint of what lay beyond. I reached for the handle. It was warm. Not from the sun, the hallway was dim, the windows shuttered against the afternoon. It was warm from the inside, as if someone had been holding it, waiting for me to arrive. I turned the handle. I pushed the door open. She was standing in the center of the room. Not the room as it was now, with its neutral walls and unfamiliar furniture. The room as it had been. Our bed, with its worn quilt, the one her grandmother had made. The dresser with the missing knob, the one I had always meant to fix. The window seat where she would sit and read on Sunday mornings, the light falling across her in a way that made me believe, for a few moments, that time could be stopped. She was standing in the center of that room, in the center of that time, wearing the same blue sweater she had worn on the last morning I saw her. Her back was to me. Her hair was the same dark brown, the same slight wave at the ends. She was looking out the window, at a view that no longer existed, the maple tree we had planted together, the one the new owners had cut down to make room for a patio. I made a sound. Not a word. Just the air leaving my lungs in a rush that was half gasp, half sob. She turned. Her face was the same. Exactly the same. The small scar above her left eyebrow, from a childhood fall. The slight asymmetry of her smile, the one she had always been self-conscious about. The eyes, gray and deep, that had looked at me across 10,000 breakfast tables and 10,000 pillowcases. She looked at me, and she smiled, and the smile held no surprise, no confusion, no sense that she had been waiting or that I was late. "You found it," she said. Her voice was exactly as I remembered. Quiet, a little rough at the edges, the voice of someone who had spent a lifetime speaking only what needed to be said. Found what? My own voice was a stranger's, thin and cracked. "The room," she said. "The one you never really left." I looked around. The room was solid, real, as vivid as any present moment I had ever occupied. The quilt, with its familiar pattern. The dresser with its missing knob. The window seat, the maple tree beyond it, the light falling exactly as it had fallen on 1,000 Sunday mornings. It was not a memory. It was a place. A room that had continued to exist, independent of the house that had been built around it, independent of the years that had passed outside its walls. How is this possible? I asked, though I already knew the answer. She had always been here. She had never left. The room had held her, the way it had held the light and the quilt and the view of the tree, all of it preserved in the amber of a moment that had refused to end. I don't know, she said. I just woke up here one day. Or maybe I never woke up. Maybe I just stayed. She gestured at the room, at its impossible persistence. It's not so bad. It's quiet. And I always know you're coming, even before you turn the handle. I crossed the room, the distance that was both a few steps and a lifetime. I reached for her. My hand passed through the space where her shoulder should have been. There was no resistance, no cold, no sensation at all. Just the empty air and the fading afterimage of her presence. She looked down at the place where my hand had been, then back up at me. Her smile did not falter. You can't stay, she said. This room isn't for that. It's just a doorway. A place where we can meet, sometimes. A doorway to where? She tilted her head, the same gesture she had always used when I asked a question that had no answer. To wherever you are. To wherever you've been. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you found it. That you came back. I wanted to ask more. I wanted to ask if she was lonely, if she was aware of the years passing, if she remembered the last morning, the argument, the door closing behind me with a finality I had never intended. But the room was already fading, its edges softening, the light growing thin and diffuse. The quilt lost its pattern. The dresser dissolved into a suggestion of wood. The window seat became a blur of light and shadow. She was still there, at the center of the dissolving, her gray eyes holding mine with that same patient, knowing look. She raised her hand, not in farewell, but in acknowledgement. A simple gesture. A confirmation. The door closed behind me. I was standing in the upstairs hallway of a stranger's house, facing a blank, painted door that led to a bedroom I had never seen. The handle was cool beneath my fingers. The room beyond it was silent, empty, furnished with someone else's life. I left the house. I locked the door behind me with the key that no longer fit any lock I recognized. I drove away without looking back. But I know now. There is a room, somewhere, that has held her all these years. It is not in the house. It is not in the past. It is in the space between, the place you reach when you finally stop running long enough to turn around. She stands in its doorway, waiting, not for me to return, but for me to remember that I have never really left. The house had been empty for 6 years. Not abandoned, the taxes were paid, the utilities maintained at a trickle, the lawn mowed by a service that sent the same silent man every other Thursday. It was simply uninhabited, a shell waiting for a decision I could never bring myself to make. Sell it, my friend said. Rent it. Burn it down and collect the insurance. But I could not. The house held something I was not ready to release, and I was not ready to name what that something was. I came back on a Tuesday, as I always did. The key still fit, though the lock was stiff with disuse. I pushed the door open and stepped into the foyer, where the air was cool and still and smelled of dust and the faint, sweet decay of old wood. The house received me without welcome, without resistance. It simply waited. I moved through the rooms in my usual circuit. The living room, where the furniture still sat under white sheets like ghosts of themselves. The kitchen, where the last coffee cup I had used still stood in the drying rack, a tiny monument to the morning I had walked out. The stairs, each one groaning under my weight in a pattern I had memorized as a child, when I would sneak down on Christmas mornings, counting the creaks to measure my progress. The bedroom door at the end of the hall was closed. It was always closed. I had not opened it in 6 years. I did not open it today. I stood before it, as I always did, my hand hovering over the brass handle, my breath held in the familiar suspension between intention and action. And then, for the first time, I noticed the hinges. They were old, these hinges. Cast iron, painted over so many times that their original shape was softened into a rounded geometry. They held the door to the frame with the patient strength of things that have outlasted their purpose. And they were waiting. I could feel it, a tension in the metal, a held breath, a readiness. I reached out, not for the handle, but for the hinge itself. My finger traced its curve, the cool, painted surface. And it creaked. Not the door. Not the floor. The hinge. It spoke. The sound was not the mechanical groan of old metal. It was a voice. A voice I recognized. It said my name. I jerked my hand back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The hallway was silent. The door was still closed. The hinge was just a hinge, still and ordinary. But the sound lingered in the air, a vibration that seemed to have traveled not through the metal but through me, through the accumulated sediment of my own history. I waited. The house waited with me. I reached out again, more slowly this time, my finger finding the same spot on the same hinge. I pressed. The hinge creaked again. This time, the voice was clearer. It was my own voice, but younger. Not the voice of the man I had become, with its careful hesitations and practiced silences. The voice of the boy I had been, the one who had run through these halls with a certainty that the world would always be this wide, this welcoming, this full of possibility. The voice said a word I had not heard in decades. A nickname. A name only one person had ever called me, and she had been dead for 20 years. I stumbled back, my shoulder hitting the opposite wall. The hinge was still. The house was still. But the air around me was thick with the presence of all the selves I had left behind in these rooms. The boy who had learned to ride a bike on the driveway. The teenager who had first fallen in love on the living room couch. The young man who had stood at this very door, arguing with a woman who would one day become a stranger. They were all here, compressed into the grain of the wood, the warp of the floorboards, the patient, articulate metal of the hinges. I approached the door again, but differently this time. Not with the dread of what lay beyond, but with the curiosity of an archaeologist approaching a site where the past had not been buried but preserved. I touched the top hinge. It creaked, and I heard my grandmother's voice, calling me in for dinner on a summer evening I had long since forgotten. The middle hinge spoke in the clipped, efficient tones of my father, giving instructions I had ignored. The bottom hinge, the one closest to the floor, held the soft, wordless hum of my mother, singing in the kitchen while I played at her feet. I stood before the door, surrounded by the chorus of my own history, and understood at last why I had never been able to open it. The room beyond was not the source of my fear. The fear was in the hinges, in the voices they held, in the weight of all the selves I would have to acknowledge before I could step through. I reached for the handle. The hinges did not speak. They were waiting, patient, their voices spent. I turned the handle. The door swung open. The room beyond was empty. No furniture, no ghosts, no lingering traces of the life that had ended here. Just a bare floor, a blank window, the gray light of a Tuesday afternoon falling on nothing. The room had been waiting, not to confront me with the past, but to offer me the present. A clean space. An empty room. A place I could fill with whatever came next. I stepped inside. The door closed behind me with a soft, final click. The hinges did not creak. They had said everything they needed to say. The hinges creaked with the voice of someone I used to be. And I, who had spent 6 years avoiding that sound, finally understood that the voices were not accusations. They were invitations. Invitations to remember that I had been many selves, and that none of them were lost. They were here, in the hinges, in the walls, in the patient architecture of a house that had held me my entire life and would hold me still, long after I had finally learned to open the door. The door was not a door I recognized. It appeared in the alley between the laundromat and the old bakery, a door I had passed 1,000 times without seeing. Wooden, weathered, its paint faded to a soft, anonymous gray. It stood slightly ajar, as if waiting for someone who had forgotten an appointment. I should have walked past. I should have kept my eyes on the familiar pavement, my mind on the familiar loop of worry and regret that carried me through each day. But the door was open, and the gap was dark, and something in the quality of that darkness was not an absence but an invitation. I pushed. The door swung inward without resistance, without sound. I stepped through. The alley on the other side was the same alley. Same brick walls, same dumpster, same pattern of cracks in the asphalt. But the light was different. Softer, earlier. The shadows stretched longer, the way they do in late afternoon rather than the encroaching dusk I had just left. I turned, expecting to see the door behind me. There was no door. Just the blank wall of the bakery, solid and unbroken. I walked to the end of the alley and stepped onto the street. It was my street. The same row of brownstones, the same ginkgo trees, the same cracked pavement I had walked 10,000 times. But the woman coming toward me, walking a small, scruffy dog, was a woman I had not seen in years. A neighbor, long moved away. She smiled as she passed, a smile of casual recognition, and I realized with a cold, creeping certainty that she was seeing someone she knew, someone who belonged to this moment, this softer light. I looked at my hands. They were my hands. The same scars, the same veins. I touched my face. It felt the same. But everything else was shifted, tilted, a half step out of alignment. I walked on, my footsteps uncertain, my eyes scanning for the familiar landmarks of my own life. I passed the corner store where I bought my coffee. Through the window, I saw myself. Not a reflection. A younger version, standing at the counter, handing over a crumpled bill for a paper cup. I, looked tired, but in a different way. The tiredness of a long day, not the accumulated exhaustion of years. His shoulders were straighter. His hair was darker. He accepted the coffee, turned, and walked out the door. I pressed myself against the wall of the neighboring building, heart hammering, as he passed within inches of where I stood, utterly unaware of my presence. I followed him. Not deliberately, my feet simply would not move in any other direction. He walked the route I had walked 1,000 times, past the brownstones, past the ginkgos, past the fire hydrant with the faded red paint. He paused at the corner, waiting for the light, and I saw him glance at his phone, saw the slight furrow of concentration on his face. I knew what he was reading. A message from her. The message that would change everything, that would begin the long, slow unraveling of the life we had built together. I wanted to call out. I wanted to stop him, to warn him, to tell him that the words on that screen were not the end but the beginning of an ending that would stretch for years. But my voice was locked in my throat. I could only watch as he crossed the street, as he disappeared around the corner, as the soft afternoon light carried him away from me and toward the moment I had spent so long trying to forget. I stood at the corner, the light cycling from red to green and back again, and understood at last where the door had led. Not to a different place. To a different time. Hours earlier. Just hours. The smallest possible gap in the fabric of continuity. Enough to see myself, to witness the moment before everything changed, but not enough to intervene. Not enough to save him. Not enough to save me. I walked on. The street was the same street. The buildings were the same buildings. But the air was different, charged with the electricity of a moment that had not yet become memory. I reached my building. My key still fit. I climbed the stairs to my apartment. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open. He was sitting on the sofa, his phone in his hand, staring at the screen with an expression I recognized too well. The moment of impact. The point at which the words on the display became a wound that would never fully heal. He did not look up as I entered. He could not see me. I was a ghost from his future, watching him bleed. I sat on the chair across from him, the chair I would sit in for countless sleepless nights in the years to come. I watched him read the message again, and again, as if repetition could change its meaning. I watched him place the phone on the coffee table, face down, as if that could undo the seeing. I watched him press the heels of his hands into his eyes, a gesture I had inherited and repeated 10,000 times. I wanted to tell him that he would survive. That the pain would not kill him, though it would feel like it might. That he would learn to carry it, to integrate it, to become someone shaped by this moment rather than broken by it. But I could not speak. I could only witness. After a long time, he stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the street, at the same view I had looked at 1,000 times, searching for something that was not there. I stood beside him, close enough to see the reflection of his face in the glass. Younger. Softer. Unmarked by the years that had carved their paths into my own reflection. He turned, and for a moment, his gaze passed directly through me. Not seeing, but pausing. A flicker of something, recognition, confusion, crossed his face. Then he walked into the bedroom and closed the door. I stood at the window, looking out at the street where I had just walked, where a younger version of myself had just passed, where the afternoon light was slowly deepening toward the dusk I had left behind. I was hours younger, and hours older, and the gap between them was the span of a single, irrevocable moment. I do not know how long I stood there. The light shifted, the shadows lengthened, the street lamps flickered on in their slow, amber procession. Eventually, I walked to the door of the apartment. I opened it. The hallway was the same hallway. I descended the stairs. The street was the same street. I walked back toward the alley, toward the place where the door had been. It was still there. Waiting. Slightly ajar. I stepped through. The alley on the other side was dark, the dusk I had left behind now fully settled into night. The door closed behind me with a soft, final click. I turned. It was gone. Just the blank wall of the bakery, solid and unbroken. I walked home. My apartment was dark, empty, exactly as I had left it. The coffee cup from that morning still sat on the kitchen counter. The message was still on my phone, faded now, a scar rather than a wound. I sat on the sofa, in the same spot where I had watched myself bleed, and I thought about the younger man I had left behind, still standing at that window, still carrying the fresh weight of a moment he did not yet understand. I stepped through a door and found myself walking this same street, hours younger. I witnessed myself at the moment of impact. And I understood, at last, that time is not a line but a loop, a series of doors we can step through if we are brave enough, or desperate enough, or simply open to the possibility that we are never only one version of ourselves. I am here, hours older, carrying the memory of watching myself not know what I now know. And somewhere, in that same soft afternoon light, a younger version of me is still standing at that window, still waiting for the pain to become something he can carry. I cannot save him. I can only remember him. And that, perhaps, is enough. I had been standing in the hallway for what felt like hours, though the clock on my phone insisted it had been only minutes. The door was closed. Not the door to my apartment, not the door to the street, but the door I had just stepped through, the one that led back to the room where she was still standing, still waiting, still holding the space I had just left. She had not said goodbye. She had simply reached for the handle, her hand pale and steady, and pulled the door toward her with a gentleness that felt like the most profound violence I had ever experienced. The latch clicked into place with a sound so soft it was almost not a sound at all. Just a whisper of metal meeting metal, a tiny, definitive punctuation at the end of a sentence I had not finished writing. I stood there, my hand raised, my fingers inches from the wood, frozen in the posture of someone who had been about to knock but had forgotten why. The door was just a door. Painted white, like all the others on this floor. A number, 3B, in the same generic brass as the rest. Nothing distinguished it. Nothing marked it as the threshold to a room that held the only person I had ever truly known. I did not knock. I could not. The silence on the other side was too complete, too absolute. It was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of something being held, carefully, deliberately, like a breath. She was on the other side, still as stone, her hand perhaps still resting on the handle, her ear perhaps tilted toward the wood, listening for the sound of my footsteps moving away. I did not move. The hallway was dim, lit only by the weak bulb at the far end, its light too tired to reach this far. The carpet under my feet was the same institutional beige I had walked on 1,000 times, in 1,000 buildings just like this one. But this building was not like the others. This hallway was not like the others. This door, with its generic number and its generic paint, held something I would never find again. I remembered how she had looked in the moment before she closed it. The soft light from the window behind her had outlined her figure, had caught the edges of her hair and turned them to gold. Her face had been calm, utterly calm, with the serenity of someone who had made a decision and would not waver from it. She had looked at me, not with sadness, not with regret, but with a deep, quiet acknowledgement. Yes, that look said. Asterisk, this is what must happen. This is the shape of it. Asterisk, she had not spoken. There was nothing left to say. The words had all been said, in the hours before, in the years before, in the long, slow accumulation of a shared life that had finally reached its natural conclusion. Not an ending, she had said once. A completion. Like a sentence that finally finds its period after pages and pages of wandering clauses. I had not understood then. I understood now. Her hand had reached for the handle. The door had begun its slow, silent swing. And in that final moment, before the wood interposed itself between us, she had smiled. Just a small smile. Just a curve of the lips that held no happiness and no sorrow, only the quiet satisfaction of a job completed, a task finished, a door closed with the exact amount of force required to make it stay closed forever. The latch clicked. The sound hung in the air for a moment, then dissolved into the deeper silence of the hallway. I was alone. Not the alone of solitude, which can be filled with the murmur of one's own thoughts. This was the alone of erasure, of having been removed from the equation, of no longer being a variable in anyone's calculation. I lowered my hand. I turned away from the door. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps absorbed by the beige carpet, my shadow stretching and shrinking under the tired bulbs. I reached the stairs. I descended. The lobby was empty, the night beyond the glass doors a deep, starless black. I pushed through into the cold air and kept walking. I did not look back. I could not. The building behind me was just a building, its windows dark, its facade indifferent. The door on the third floor, number 3B, was just a door. But I knew, with a certainty that would never leave me, that on the other side of that door, she was still standing. Still. Still holding the silence I had left behind. She had closed the door softly, like tucking time away. And I, who had spent my whole life moving forward, had finally learned that some doors are not meant to be opened again. They are meant to be closed, gently, deliberately, with the full weight of everything that has been and everything that will never be again. The latch clicks. The silence settles. And you walk away, not because you want to, but because the door has already closed, and standing on the threshold accomplishes nothing. I am still walking. The city unfolds before me, indifferent and vast. But somewhere behind me, in a room I will never enter again, she is still standing. Still holding the silence. Still smiling that small, final smile. The door is closed. Time is tucked away. And I am learning, slowly, that this is what completion feels like. Not an ending. Just a door, closed softly, behind everything that mattered. The house had been in my dreams for as long as I could remember. Not always the same house, sometimes it was the farmhouse of my childhood, sometimes the narrow row house of my 20s, sometimes a structure I had never seen before but recognized with the deep, bone-level certainty of a recurring vision. But always, in every iteration, there was a threshold. A doorstep. A line between outside and inside that I could never quite cross. I had come back to the real house, the original one, the place where I had spent the first 18 years of my life. It was empty now, had been empty for decades, its owners long moved to warmer climates, its rooms holding nothing but the slow decay of neglect. I had no business being here. The current owners lived 3 states away and had never responded to my letters asking for permission to visit. But the house was not locked. It had never been locked. The people of this small town still believed in a kind of trust that cities had long since abandoned. I stood at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at the door I had walked through 10,000 times as a child. The paint was peeling, the screen door long since replaced by a storm door I did not recognize, but the shape of it was the same. The same proportions. The same position in space. The same threshold, worn by decades of feet, waiting for one more set to cross it. I climbed the steps. The wood groaned under my weight, the same groan I remembered from 100 summer evenings, when I would race up these stairs 2 at a time, late for dinner, my mother's voice calling from somewhere inside. The sound was a key turning in a lock I had forgotten existed. I reached the door. I looked down. The threshold was made of stone, a single slab of worn granite that had been laid when the house was built, in a time before anyone in this town could remember. It was deeply worn, its surface smooth as glass in the center, its edges still rough with the original quarry marks. And across its entire surface, layered and overlapping, was a palimpsest of footprints. Not the footprints of strangers, of the countless people who had crossed this threshold over the decades. These were my footprints. Every one of them. The small, splayed prints of a toddler, just learning to walk, placed with the careful uncertainty of new legs. The wider, more confident prints of a child, running in and out without a thought, the soles of sneakers leaving their distinct, geometric pattern. The prints of a teenager, heavier, dragging, the heels worn down in a way that spoke of reluctance and longing. The prints of a young man, leaving for the last time, pausing on the threshold for a moment that had stretched into decades. I knelt on the porch, my hands hovering over the stone, not touching, just tracing the air above the evidence of my own history. The prints overlapped, layered, some so faint they were barely visible, others as clear as if they had been made yesterday. They told a story I had never known I was writing. A story of coming and going, of entering and exiting, of 1,000 small crossings that had worn this stone smooth without ever erasing the record of their passage. I saw the print from the night I had come home late, 17 years old, drunk for the first time, stumbling up these steps with a friend's arm around my shoulder. The print was skewed, off balance, the heel deeper than the toe, a record of a moment I had tried for decades to forget. It was there, clear as the others, preserved in the stone as if waiting for this exact moment of recognition. I saw the print from the morning I had left for college, my bag heavy on my shoulder, my mother standing in the doorway behind me, her hand raised in a wave I had not turned to see. The print was deliberate, placed with the weight of intention, the toe pointing away from the house in a way that spoke of departure and the strange excitement of never looking back. I saw prints I did not recognize. Prints that were mine, undeniably mine, the same size, the same gait, the same distinctive wear pattern on the outside edge of the left heel, but placed in moments I could not remember. Prints that suggested I had crossed this threshold hundreds of times more than my conscious memory could account for. Prints that hinted at a life lived in parallel, a version of me who had never really left, who had continued to enter and exit this house through all the years I had been gone, tending to some invisible business I would never understand. I stood, my knees aching, and looked at the door. It was just a door. Painted white, with a brass handle worn smooth by countless hands. But the threshold beneath it held the record of every version of me who had ever stood here. The boy. The teenager. The young man leaving. The stranger I had become. And perhaps, if the prince I did not recognize were any indication, the man I might still become, returning one last time to cross this threshold and close the door behind him for good. I reached for the handle. My hand paused. I looked down at the stone. My current footprint, the one I was about to make, would join the others. It would layer itself over the print of the 17-year-old drunk, the 18-year-old leaving, the countless versions of me I had forgotten or never known. It would become part of the palimpsest, one more record of crossing, one more mark on a stone that had been holding these marks for longer than anyone could remember. I turned the handle. The door opened. I stepped inside. The threshold bore footprints of every version of me who had tried to enter. And I, the latest in a long line of selves, finally understood that entering was not the point. The point was the record. The point was the stone. The point was that I had been here before, and would be here again, in forms I could not yet imagine, leaving prints that would layer over these prints, wearing the stone smoother and smoother, until one day there would be nothing left but a smooth, polished surface, reflecting the sky, holding no record of anyone at all. The house had been sold 17 years ago, the proceeds divided among siblings who had long since scattered to different states, different lives, different versions of themselves. I had not been back since the day the movers loaded the last truck, the day I stood on the front lawn and watched my childhood being packed into cardboard and driven away. I had not said goodbye to the house itself. I had not known how. The letter that brought me here was from a stranger, a woman who had bought the house 5 years after we left and was now preparing to sell it again. She had found a box in the attic, she wrote, addressed to me, covered in dust, unopened. She did not know how it had been overlooked by the previous owners, how it had survived 3 moves, 2 estate sales, and 17 years of someone else's life. But it was there, waiting, and she thought I should have it. I drove the 12 hours without stopping, the box's contents a mystery I was not ready to solve. I arrived in the late afternoon, the autumn light long and golden, the kind of light that makes even the most ordinary things look like they belong in a photograph. The house was the same. Exactly the same. The same pale yellow siding, the same black shutters, the same brick path winding through a lawn that had been replanted and reshaped but still held the ghost of the flower beds my mother had tended. The same front door, painted the same deep red, with the same brass mail slot I had peered through 1,000 times as a child, waiting for the sound of the postman's footsteps. The woman met me at the door, kind and apologetic, apologizing for the intrusion, for the box, for the years it had taken to find me. I assured her it was no intrusion. I took the box, heavy and mysterious, and thanked her. She invited me in. I declined. I was not ready to cross that threshold. Not yet. I sat on the front steps, the box beside me, and let the afternoon deepen around me. The neighborhood was the same. The same trees, larger now, their branches spreading across the same streets. The same houses, painted different colors, occupied by different people, but holding the same shapes, the same positions in space. The same sounds, children playing somewhere down the block, a dog barking, the distant hum of a lawnmower. It was as if I had never left. As if the 17 years between then and now were a dream I was just now waking from. I turned and looked at the door. The mail slot was still there, its brass dulled by time but unmistakable. I had not looked through it since I was a child, since the days when I would press my face against the door, my eye to the narrow opening, and watch the world pass by in slices. The mailman's legs. The neighbor's dog. The occasional car. It had been my window onto a world I was not yet old enough to enter. I stood. I walked to the door. I knelt before the mail slot, my knees pressing into the same cold concrete of the porch, the same rough surface I had knelt on 1,000 times. I lifted the brass flap. It was heavier than I remembered, stiffer, but it gave. I put my eye to the opening. The hallway beyond was the same. The same dark wood floor, worn smooth by decades of feet. The same staircase, rising to the left, its banister curving gracefully toward the second floor. The same light, falling through the window at the top of the stairs, casting the same pattern of shadows on the same wall. The same coat rack, empty now, but holding the ghost of all the coats that had hung there, my father's work jacket, my mother's raincoat, my own school jacket with the broken zipper. But it was not empty. The hallway was not empty. The house was not empty. It was waiting. I could feel it in the quality of the light, in the settled dust, in the way the shadows held their positions with a patience that was not passive but expectant. The house had been waiting for 17 years. Waiting for someone to look through this mail slot, to see it as it was, to remember that it had never stopped being home. I saw myself, a child of 8, running down that hallway, my footsteps echoing on the wood, my laughter trailing behind me like a banner. I saw my mother, standing at the foot of the stairs, calling up to my father that dinner was ready. I saw my sister, sitting on the bottom step, tying her shoes, her hair in the same ponytail she had worn every day of 6th grade. I saw them all, not as ghosts, but as presences, as impressions left in the fabric of the house itself, waiting for the right eye to see them. I held my breath. The hallway held its breath with me. The light shifted, just slightly, as the sun dipped behind a cloud. The shadows stretched, reached, settled into new positions. The house breathed. I felt it in the slight movement of the air through the mail slot, in the faint creak of the floorboards, in the way the silence itself seemed to have a pulse. I did not call out. I did not try to enter. I simply watched, my eye pressed to the narrow opening, witnessing the house as it had always been, as it would always be, waiting for someone to remember that it was still there. The box sat on the steps behind me, its contents still unknown, its mystery intact. But the real mystery was here, on the other side of this door, in this hallway I had run through 1,000 times, in this house that had held my life and was holding it still. I lowered the mail slot. The brass flap closed with a soft, final click. I stood, my knees aching, my eyes wet with something that was not quite tears. I picked up the box. I walked back to my car. I did not look back. But I will. I will come back to this door, to this mail slot, to this hallway that has held my childhood for 17 years. I will come back, and I will look again, and I will see the same thing I saw today, a house that has never stopped waiting, a home that has never stopped being home. The box in my car holds something I have not yet opened. But the house holds everything I have ever been. And that, I am finally ready to understand, is the only inheritance that matters. The house had been closed for 30 years. Not abandoned, my aunt had seen to that, paying a local handyman to check the roof, clear the gutters, make sure the pipes didn't freeze. But closed. Shuttered. A container holding the atmosphere of a life that had ended when my grandmother died and the family scattered like seeds from a dry pod. I had come to open it. Not to sell, not to clear, just to open. To let the air in, to see if anything remained that was worth keeping, to perform the small, ceremonial act of unlocking a door that had been locked for 3 decades. The key was old, heavy, its brass darkened by years of sitting in a drawer. It turned with resistance, the lock mechanisms groaning after their long sleep. The door swung inward. The smell was what hit me first. Not the smell of decay or abandonment, the house had been sealed too well for that. It was the smell of stillness. Of dust settling for 30 years without disturbance. Of old paper and dry wood and the faint, sweet ghost of the lavender sachets my grandmother had always kept in the linen closet. It was the smell of a paused life, waiting for someone to press play. My cousin Alara was with me. She had always been the quiet one, the one who felt things before she saw them, who knew the names of plants and the phases of the moon and the secret language of weather. She stood beside me in the doorway, her face lifted to the still air, her eyes closed. She was not smelling the dust. She was smelling something else. The rain, she said softly. The rain from that afternoon. I knew which afternoon she meant. We all knew. The afternoon when we were 9 and 11, visiting our grandmother for the last time before she got sick, before the house became a place of hushed voices and closed doors. It had been a summer day, hot and still, and then, without warning, the sky had opened. Rain so sudden and so heavy it seemed like the world was ending. We had sat on the porch, the three of us, Alara, our grandmother, and me, watching it fall, watching the dust turn to mud, watching the garden drink and never get enough. Our grandmother had laughed, a sound I had not remembered until this moment. She had reached out and caught rain in her palm and held it out to us, a tiny, trembling globe of water, a world in miniature. Taste it, she had said. And we had, each of us, dipping our fingers into her palm, bringing the rain to our lips. It had tasted of nothing, and of everything. Of summer and sky and the particular sweetness of being alive in a moment you do not yet know you will spend the rest of your life trying to return to. Alara walked into the house. I followed. The rooms were as we remembered them, frozen in the amber of abandonment. The same furniture, draped in white sheets that had long since turned gray. The same pictures on the walls, their subjects faded to sepia ghosts. The same books on the shelves, their spines cracked, their pages dry as dead leaves. We moved through the house like divers through a sunken ship, touching nothing, breathing carefully, afraid of disturbing the stillness. We reached the kitchen. The door to the pantry was closed. Alara stopped before it, her hand hovering over the knob. She did not turn to look at me. She simply stood, her head tilted, listening to something I could not hear. "It's in there," she said. "The rain. From that afternoon." She kept it. I wanted to ask how she knew, what she meant, whether this was poetry or memory or something stranger. But I did not. I simply watched as her hand closed around the knob, as she turned it, slowly, carefully, with the reverence of someone opening a reliquary. The door swung open. And from the darkness of the pantry, from the shelves of canned goods and preserves that had sat untouched for 30 years, a scent drifted out. The scent of rain. Not the generic smell of wet pavement or damp earth. The specific scent of that afternoon. The rain that had fallen on that day, in that place, while we sat on the porch and tasted it from our grandmother's palm. I inhaled. The scent filled me, not just my lungs but my entire body, my entire memory. I was 9 years old again, sitting on the porch, the rain roaring around me, my grandmother's arm around my shoulder, her voice laughing at something I was too young to understand. I was 9 years old, and the world was infinite, and the rain was falling, and I was safe. I was completely, utterly safe. Alara stepped back from the doorway, her eyes wet. She did not speak. She did not need to. We stood together in that kitchen, breathing the rain from a forgotten afternoon, and we let it carry us back to a time when the house was not a museum of loss but a home, warm and alive and full of the particular grace of being exactly where you were supposed to be. The scent lingered for a long time. Then, slowly, it began to fade, absorbed back into the stillness of the house, returning to whatever dimension it had come from. The pantry was just a pantry again, its shelves full of jars and boxes, its air neutral and still. Alara closed the door. She turned the knob, gently, the way you close a book you have just finished reading. She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw the same thing I felt in my own chest, a grief so deep it was almost indistinguishable from gratitude. "She kept it," Alara said. All these years. She kept the rain. We left the house that afternoon, locking the door behind us with the same heavy key. The house returned to its stillness, its paused life, its patient waiting. But we carried something with us. The scent of rain from a forgotten afternoon. The memory of our grandmother's palm, cupping a tiny world. The knowledge that some things are kept, not in jars or boxes, but in the fabric of places, in the stillness of closed rooms, waiting for someone to turn the right knob at the right moment and release them into the air again. She turned the knob, and the scent of rain from a forgotten afternoon drifted out. And I understood, finally, that the past does not end. It simply waits. In closed rooms, in sealed jars, in the patient stillness of houses that have been waiting for someone to come back and breathe them alive again. The building was old, one of those pre-war structures in the city's forgotten quarter, its facade streaked with decades of soot and neglect. I had been walking past it for years without really seeing it, my eyes sliding over its details the way they slid over everything in this neighborhood I had long since stopped noticing. But tonight, something made me stop. A flicker in my peripheral vision. A change where change should not be. I turned. The door was the same as it had always been. Heavy, dark wood, its surface scarred by time and weather. A brass handle, dull with age. Above it, a small metal plaque held the apartment number. 4B, I blinked. The number was 3B. I blinked again. 2B, I stood frozen on the sidewalk, my eyes fixed on that small rectangle of metal, waiting for the next blink, the next change. It came. 1B, the numbers were counting down. Not with each blink of my eyes, but with each moment of attention, each second I held them in my gaze. The count was steady, inexorable, the intervals between changes precisely the length of a human blink, whether I blinked or not. I looked away. I forced my eyes to the street, to the parked cars, to the distant glow of the all-night diner at the corner. When I looked back, the number was 4B again. Waiting. Ready to begin its descent once more. I did not go in. Not that night. I went home, to my own apartment, to my own numbered door, and I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, counting the blinks I could not control, wondering what number would appear when I finally closed my eyes. The next night, I returned. The building was the same. The door was the same. The number was 4B. I stood before it, my hand in my pocket, my keys cold against my palm. I did not blink. I held my eyes open, wide, staring at the metal plaque until they burned, until tears blurred my vision, until I could no longer keep them open. I blinked. 3B, I understood then. The count was not in my control. It was happening, whether I participated or not. Each blink was a step closer to something, and I had no idea what waited at 0. I began to visit the building every night. I would stand across the street, in the shadow of the shuttered bakery, and watch the door from a distance. The number glowed faintly in the ambient light, always 4B at the start of my vigil. But as the hours passed, as the city quieted and the streetlights dimmed, it would begin its descent. Not with my blinks, from this distance, I could blink freely and the number held steady. It was only when I stood before it, when I gave it my full attention, that the count would engage. It was waiting for me. It was counting for me. I dreamed of the door. In my dreams, I stood before it, and the number descended with each blink, faster now, a rapid countdown that left no time for breath. 4B, 3B, 2B, 1B, and then, nothing. 0. The plaque empty, the brass bare, the door swinging open on its own. I woke before I could see what lay beyond. I had to know. The obsession had become a hunger, a need that eclipsed everything else. I stopped going to work. I stopped answering my phone. I spent my days in a gray daze, waiting for night, waiting for the walk to that forgotten street, waiting for the door and its patient count. On the 7th night, I stood before it and did not look away. I let the numbers fall. 4B, blink. 3B, blink. 2B, blink. 1B, I held my eyes open, wide, burning, waiting for the final blink that would bring 0. But the number did not change. It held at 1B, steady, waiting. The count had paused. It was waiting for something else. Waiting for me. I reached for the handle. The brass was cold, colder than it should have been, cold as the metal of a vault. I turned it. The door swung open. Beyond was not a lobby, not a hallway, not any interior I could recognize. It was a room, vast and dim, its walls lined with doors. Hundreds of doors, thousands, each one numbered. 4B, 3B. 2B, 1B. The numbers repeated, over and over, stretching into an impossible distance. And at the far end of the room, a single door with no number. Just a smooth, blank surface, waiting. I stepped inside. The door closed behind me with a soft, final click. I walked through the forest of doors, my footsteps echoing in the vast silence, my eyes scanning the endless repetition of numbers I had come to know so well. They were all the same, and yet each one was slightly different, a different grain of wood, a different patina on the brass, a different quality of light around its edges. I reached the door with no number. I stood before it, my hand raised, my breath held. I did not blink. I did not need to. The count was over. This was 0. This was what had been waiting. I turned the handle. The door swung open. Beyond was not another room, not another hallway, not another numbered door. Beyond was the street where I had started. The building across the way. The door I had just entered, now visible from the outside, its plaque reading 4B. The count had reset. It was waiting for me to begin again. I stepped through. The door closed behind me. I stood on the familiar sidewalk, in the familiar night, and I understood. The count was not a countdown to an ending. It was a cycle. A loop. A door that would always be 4B, that would always count down when I looked at it, that would always open onto a room full of doors, that would always lead me back to this same street, this same night, this same moment of infinite recurrence. I have not gone back. I will not go back. But I know the door is still there, at the end of that forgotten street, its number patiently counting down with each blink of anyone who stands before it. And somewhere, in the vast room beyond, a door with no number is waiting for someone brave enough, or desperate enough, to understand that 0 is not an ending. It is a beginning. The beginning of the same thing, over and over, until you finally learn to stop blinking. The fire escape was rusted, its metal grating flaking orange-brown in the late afternoon light. I had climbed it 1,000 times as a child, up to the roof where the city spread out like a promise, down to the alley where we played games I had long since forgotten. The building had been abandoned for years now, its windows boarded, its lobby sealed, its fire escape left to the slow work of oxidation and neglect. I had no reason to be here. I was just passing through the old neighborhood, the way you do when nostalgia becomes a kind of gravitational pull. I stopped at the base of the fire escape. The ladder was still there, the one that could be pulled down from above but never was, not anymore. I looked up at the 5th floor, at the window that had been mine, now covered with a sheet of plywood that had weathered to the same gray as the building's brick. I could almost see myself at that window, a boy of 10, pressing my face to the glass, watching for my mother's car to turn the corner. That's when I heard it. Not from the building. From behind the fire escape. From the narrow gap between the metal structure and the brick wall, where shadows pooled even in the brightest light. A voice. My mother's voice. Calling me in for dinner. It was not a memory. It was not the echo of a memory, the kind that plays in your head when you pass a familiar place. It was sound, actual sound, traveling through the air and reaching my ears. The same voice I had heard 10,000 times, calling from the kitchen window, telling me to wash up, to come inside, to stop playing and eat. Daniel. Dinner. I stood frozen, my heart a sudden, frantic percussion against my ribs. The voice was clear, unmistakable, as real as the rust on the fire escape, as real as the ache in my legs from standing too long. It came from behind that metal grating, from the darkness between the fire escape and the wall, from a space too narrow for any person to occupy. I moved toward it. My feet were not obeying me, they were obeying something older, deeper, the instinct of a child called home. I reached the fire escape. I pressed my face to the gap between the metal and the brick. The darkness beyond was absolute, a black so complete it seemed to absorb the light from the afternoon around me. I could see nothing. But I could hear. Footsteps. The soft, familiar pad of my mother's feet on the kitchen linoleum. The clink of a pot being placed on the stove. The scrape of a chair being pulled out from the table. The sounds of dinner being prepared, of a house coming alive with the routine of evening, all of it coming from that impossible darkness behind the fire escape. Daniel. It's ready. Come inside. I reached into the gap. My hand passed through the darkness and met nothing. No wall, no metal, no surface of any kind. Just the same absolute black, cool and still, like the air inside a closet that has been closed for a very long time. I leaned further, my shoulder pressing against the rusted metal, my eyes straining to see something, anything, in that perfect void. A light flickered. Far away, impossibly far, a warm yellow glow appeared in the darkness. It was small at first, a pinprick, then larger, taking shape. A kitchen window. Our kitchen window. The one I had looked through 1,000 times, watching my mother move between stove and sink, her hands busy with the ordinary magic of making dinner. The window grew closer, or I grew closer to it, and through it I could see the kitchen as it had been. The same yellow curtains. The same round table. The same chair where I had sat every evening, doing homework while my mother cooked. She was there. At the stove. Her back to me. The same gray hair, pulled back in the same loose bun. The same blue apron, the one with the flour stain she could never quite wash out. She was stirring something in a pot, the same pot, the one with the wooden handle that was always slightly loose. Steam rose from the pot, carrying the smell of her cooking, the smell of childhood, of safety, of home. Daniel. Don't make me call you again. Her voice was closer now, not coming from the kitchen but from the darkness around me, from the space between me and that impossible window. I wanted to answer. I wanted to call out, to tell her I was here, to ask how this was possible, to beg her to turn around so I could see her face one more time. But my voice was locked in my throat. I could only watch. She turned. Not toward me, but toward the table, toward the place where I should have been sitting. She carried the pot, steaming, and set it on a trivet. She straightened, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked at the empty chair with an expression I could not quite read. Not sadness. Not expectation. Just a quiet, patient waiting, as if she knew I would come eventually, as if time meant nothing in this kitchen beyond the fire escape. She reached for something on the counter. A photograph. She held it up, looking at it, and I saw that it was a photograph of me. Not the boy I had been, not the man I had become, but something in between, a version of me I did not recognize, captured in a moment I could not remember. She touched the photograph gently, her finger tracing the outline of the face, and then she placed it on the table, propped against the salt shaker, facing the empty chair. The light began to fade. The kitchen window grew smaller, more distant, receding back into the darkness from which it had come. The warm glow diminished to a pinprick, then to nothing. The sounds of cooking faded, replaced by the same absolute silence I had heard when I first pressed my face to the gap. I pulled back from the fire escape. My face was wet, I did not know when I had started crying. The afternoon light was unchanged, the rust still orange, the building still abandoned. I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence, waiting for the voice to call again. It did not. I have come back every day since. I press my face to the gap, I reach into the darkness, I wait for the light to flicker and the sounds to begin. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes I see the kitchen, my mother at the stove, the table set for one. Sometimes I hear her voice, calling me in for dinner, the same words, the same tone, the same patient expectation. I have never been able to answer. I have never been able to step through that darkness into the kitchen where she waits. But I will keep coming. I will keep listening. Because somewhere, behind that fire exit, in a kitchen that exists outside of time, my mother is still cooking dinner. She is still waiting for me to come inside. And one day, I will find the strength to answer. One day, I will step through the darkness and sit in that empty chair and let her feed me one more meal, in a house that has been waiting for me all along. I heard my mother's voice call me in for dinner, from behind a fire exit. And I am still listening. The door was never meant to be opened. That's what the real estate agent had said, what the paperwork had said, what the city's historical preservation office had confirmed in their dry, official language. The old theater had been sealed in 1959, after the fire that killed no one but damaged enough to make repair uneconomical. The owners had simply locked the doors, walked away, and let time do the rest. The building had been sold and resold over the decades, always with the same condition: the theater itself, the auditorium, was to remain sealed. A tomb for a space that had once been alive. I had bought the building for the storefronts on the ground floor, the ones that faced the street and could be rented to the kind of boutiques and cafes that were slowly reviving this forgotten part of the city. The theater upstairs was just an inconvenience, a sealed space I would never need to enter, a piece of history I could ignore. That was the plan. But plans have a way of yielding to the pressure of curiosity, and curiosity has a way of finding the smallest openings. Her name was Lena, and she was the building's previous owner, the one who had sold it to me after holding it for 40 years. She was old now, her hands knotted with arthritis, her eyes the pale blue of winter sky. She had come to the building on the day I took possession, not to say goodbye, but to show me something. She had not said what. She had simply asked me to follow her up the stairs. We climbed past the second floor, past the third, to a door I had not noticed before. It was small, narrow, the kind of door that might lead to a closet or a service stairwell. It was painted the same color as the wall, its edges nearly invisible. Lena stopped before it. She did not reach for the handle. She simply stood, her head tilted, listening to something I could not hear. "This door," she said, her voice soft, "was never locked." Not really. They sealed the theater, but they forgot this door. Or maybe they didn't forget. Maybe they left it on purpose, knowing that someday someone would need to remember. She reached out and turned the handle. The door swung open, not onto a closet or a stairwell, but onto a narrow passage, dark and cool, smelling of old dust and older air. She did not step through. She simply held the door, just slightly ajar, just enough for something to pass. I looked past her, into the darkness. I could see nothing. But I could feel something. A presence. Not a person, not a ghost, but something more diffuse, the accumulated weight of all the evenings that had happened in that sealed theater, all the laughter and tears and whispers, all the moments that had been trapped when the doors closed in 1959. "Wait," Lena said. "Watch." I watched. The darkness in the passage did not change, but something moved within it. A flicker of light, distant and dim. A sound, so faint it was barely there, the murmur of a crowd, the rustle of programs, the distant, tinny echo of a voice on a long-dead sound system. The theater was not empty. It was full. Full of memory, full of moment, full of all the people who had sat in its seats and watched it screen and lived their small, precious lives in its dark embrace. Lena smiled. It was a sad smile, the smile of someone saying goodbye to something they loved. I used to come here, she said. When I was a girl. This was my door. My secret. I would sit in that theater, alone, and watch the movies that weren't playing anymore. I would watch the people who weren't there anymore. And I would remember. She let the door close, just a little, the gap narrowing to a sliver. The flicker of light dimmed. The distant murmur faded. The passage was just a passage again, dark and empty. Memory needs a way out, she said. It can't stay sealed forever. It finds cracks, openings, doors left ajar. And when it slips through, it changes you. It makes you part of something larger than yourself. She turned to me, her pale eyes holding mine. This is yours now. The building, the theater, the door. You can seal it again if you want. You can pretend it's just a closet, just a passage to nowhere. But you'll know. You'll always know that on the other side of this door, there's a theater full of people who are still watching, still waiting, still alive in the only way that matters. She left then, her slow footsteps descending the stairs, leaving me alone with the door and the narrow passage and the weight of her words. I have not opened it again. Not fully. But sometimes, in the quiet evenings after the shops below have closed and the city has settled into its nighttime rhythm, I come to this door. I turn the handle. I hold it ajar, just slightly, just enough. And through that narrow gap, memory slips. The flicker of light. The distant murmur. The sense of a space that is not empty, not abandoned, but full to overflowing with all the moments that have ever happened within it. She held the door ajar, just enough for memory to slip through. And I, who thought I was buying a building with a sealed theater, have become the keeper of a door that leads to everywhere and everyone. I hold it open, sometimes, and let the past breathe. It is the only prayer I have left. The apartment on 7th Street was the first. I had not lived there in 12 years, had not thought about it in at least 5, but there it was, its windows dark, its door the same faded blue I remembered from the year I spent learning to be alone. I was walking to a meeting I did not want to attend, taking a shortcut through a neighborhood I had no reason to be in, and there it was. Not a building that resembled it. The exact building. The exact door. The exact window where I had stood at 3 a.m., watching the city breathe, wondering if anyone else in the world was as awake and as lost as I was. I stopped. I stared. The building stared back, indifferent, patient. I had no desire to go in. The rooms inside held nothing I wanted to recover, just the ghost of a younger self, thinner and more desperate, pacing the same floorboards I had paced for a year before finally, mercifully, moving on. But the door was there. And I could not unsee it. I walked on. The meeting was a blur. The rest of the day was a blur. But that door, that faded blue door, was burned into my memory with a clarity I could not shake. The next week, it was the house on Maple. The one I had shared with her, the one we had painted together, the one where we had argued about everything and nothing and finally, inevitably, about the shape of our future. I was driving to the airport, taking the long way to avoid traffic, and there it was. Not a house that looked like it. The house. The exact house. The same white trim, the same oak tree in the front yard, the same window where I had watched her leave for the last time, her suitcase bumping down the steps, her figure growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared around the corner. I pulled over. I sat in the car, engine running, and looked at the house. The lights were on inside. Someone else lived there now, someone who had painted over the walls we had chosen, who had filled the rooms with furniture we had never seen. But the house remembered. I could feel it in the way the light fell on the porch, in the way the oak tree's branches reached toward the window, in the way the door, that door, stood closed and waiting, holding all the arguments and reconciliations and quiet mornings we had left behind. I did not get out. I did not approach. I simply sat and watched, and after a long time, I drove away. But the door stayed with me. It had opened once, and I had walked through, and I could never unopen it. The memory of crossing that threshold was as permanent as the door itself. The pattern continued. Every week, another room. The studio apartment where I had written my first bad poems. The basement unit where I had hidden from the world for a year, emerging only for food and work and the occasional desperate phone call. The house on the hill where I had been happiest, for a while, before happiness became something I could no longer afford. They appeared in my path with the regularity of a curse, each one a door I had walked through, each one a room I had lived in, each one a piece of a life I had assembled and disassembled and never quite understood. I began to avoid certain streets, certain neighborhoods, certain parts of the city where I knew the doors were waiting. But the doors found me anyway. They appeared on streets I had never taken, in neighborhoods I had never visited, in places where no building from my past had any right to exist. The city was mapping itself onto my memory, or my memory was mapping itself onto the city, and the result was a geography I could no longer navigate without tripping over the ruins of my own history. The last one was the worst. It was a door I had never seen before, on a street I did not recognize, in a part of the city I was certain I had never visited. But when I looked at it, I knew. I knew that behind this door was a room I had lived in, a life I had lived, a version of myself I had forgotten or repressed or simply never acknowledged. The door was black, unadorned, its handle a simple curve of brass. It stood in a wall that had no other features, no windows, no signs of occupancy. Just the door, waiting. I approached it. My hand reached for the handle. I did not want to open it. I knew that whatever lay beyond would change me, would add one more room to the infinite house of my past, would make the geography of my memory even more impossible to navigate. But I could not stop. The door was there, and I had seen it, and seeing it was the same as opening it. I could never unsee it. I could never unopen it. I turned the handle. The door swung inward. Beyond was a room I recognized. The room from my earliest memory, the nursery of the house where I had spent my first 3 years, a place I had not thought about in decades. It was exactly as I remembered it, the same wallpaper, with its pattern of smiling bears. The same crib, its rails worn by the grip of tiny hands. The same mobile, hanging motionless above the empty mattress. The same window, looking out on a backyard I had played in before I could walk. I stood in the doorway, looking at the room where I had learned to be a person. It was not a memory. It was a place. A real place, existing in the same city as all the other rooms, all the other doors, all the other pieces of a life I had spent 40 years assembling and disassembling and never quite understanding. I did not step inside. I could not. The room was not for entering. It was for remembering. It was for acknowledging that I had been here, that I had started here, that every door I had ever opened had led from this room and would, eventually, lead back to it. I closed the door. I walked away. The city was full of rooms I had already lived in, and doors I could never unopen. I carried them all with me now, not as memories, but as geography, a map of a life that was still being drawn, still adding rooms, still opening doors I would spend the rest of my life trying not to see.
Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.